Why didn't Sukuna use the fire arrow against Gojo? And what would have happened if he did? Let's talk about it, but spoilers beware. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that there are two separate versions of Sukuna's fire arrow. There is the original version, and then the version he created to combine with his domain expansion. The original version of the fire arrow can only hit one target, and it moves very slowly. And that's what Sukuna used in his standoff against Jogo, because both of those downsides aren't relevant. Jogo is only one person, so that doesn't matter. And the fact that it moves slowly doesn't matter because they were sitting there and literally trying their power against one another. But obviously, in most situations, the original fire arrow isn't ideal. It's just not going to get the job done. So in order to fix its weaknesses, Sukuna decided to combine the fire arrow with his domain expansion using binding vows. And how he did that was by making it so in his domain, when his cleaves and dismantles are slashing up everything, they're essentially leaving behind an explosive residue that when he then casts the fire arrow, catches everything on fire. It's like an instantaneous chain reaction. So that solves both problems, right? Because now the entire domain is filled with this hellfire. So you're not just hitting one thing, you're hitting everything within the domain. And it's also not slow because, again, it's an instantaneous chain reaction that is lighting all of those explosive particles on fire. So now, why didn't Sukuna use this against Gojo? Well, the first thing you need to realize is that there is no sure hit effect with any version of the fire arrow. Obviously, the original version, you just need to get hit by it, but even the one that's combined with his domain, it's not a sure hit effect of the domain, it's just a very creative combination of the two things. The fact that the explosive particles are all throughout the domain and they all catch fire just means everything inside of it is going to be hit. But if you have the infinity, it's not going to matter. So what that means is there's no version of the fire arrow that just bypasses the limitless, meaning the only way Sukuna would be able to hit Gojo with it was when he was in Curse Technique Burnout, like right here after his first domain expansion collapsed. So Sukuna could have theoretically used the fire arrow right here. Why didn't he? Well, the original version is too slow. Gojo would have just been able to dodge it. Now, why didn't he use the domain expansion version? Well, the narrator explains that right here, where he says, in his fight against Gojo, Sukuna changed the conditions for his barrier techniques and continually restricted the effective range, resulting in insufficient firepower, and he had been sealing his divine flame. Basically, he's saying that all of the binding vows and on-the-fly changes that both Gojo and Sukuna were making to their domain expansions made it so he essentially invalidated the binding vows that were in place that allowed him to combine his fire arrow and domain. So the conditions weren't met for him to actually do that. So the reason Sukuna didn't use this against Gojo is because he couldn't use the domain version, and the original version would have been too slow to actually hit Gojo with. Alright, so now that we've got that explanation out of the way, I want to give a big shout out to Tear Jordan and Sorcery, who both asked me, what if Sukuna had met the conditions for the domain fire arrow and he had used it against Gojo? Would that have one-shot him, or just what would have happened? Okay, so the first piece of this is to remember that there is no literal sure hit effect associated with either version of the fire arrow. Now, the domain version might as well be a sure hit effect because unless you have infinity, it's going to hit you because of how he set it up. But Gojo obviously has infinity, so if the infinity is active, then it's not going to do anything to Gojo. But if we're assuming a situation like after that first domain where Gojo's technique is on burnout, what if Sukuna had used it there? So if in this exact moment Sukuna had used the domain fire arrow, would Gojo have survived? And in my opinion, I think he likely could have healed through it the same way he was healing through all of these thousands upon thousands of slashes, right? Now, it's going to be impossible to equate like the type and kind of damage the slashes are doing to him on an instantaneous basis versus the type and kind of damage that fire explosion would do to him. But again, since he healed through this pretty easily, like he wasn't even sweating, I think he'd have the capability to heal through the fire as well. Especially because Choso was effectively able to heal through the entire thing while creating a barrier out of blood to protect Yuji. Now, it did ultimately cost him his life, but he was simultaneously creating a barrier out of blood for Yuji, and he's Choso. He is not Gojo. Now, honestly, that's just my opinion, so if you think the fire arrow would have killed him here, I think that's fine. And honestly, I think if we talk about potential fire arrows later in the fight, like after later domain expansions, then maybe those would have gotten him. Because again, here he was fresh, right? It was still the beginning of the fight. His RCT was online. His output was high. he's chilling, right? So this specific instance, I think he's going to heal through, but later, maybe he wouldn't be able to. And then finally, Tear Jordan and Sorcery had some additional questions, starting with this one from Sorcery, which was, how would I compare Sukuna's Fire Arrow to Gojo's Hollow Purple in terms of destructiveness and effectiveness? And I think it's like what use case we're looking at, right? I would say that like in a vacuum, and no pun intended with the fire arrow, Hollow Purple is probably better, but Sukuna's use of Binding Vows to combine it with his domain expansion is more effective for that scenario. Gojo still needs to hit with his Hollow Purple, right? So Sukuna found a creative way to kind of solve that problem by giving it a pseudo sure hit effect. But I do think the destructive power in general is greater from Hollow Purple. And then for the other questions Tear Jordan asked me, the first one was, did Sukuna suffer the same fate as Gojo by being caught off guard by Nobara? And I wouldn't really equate those two. Yes, he was caught off guard, but the difference, I think, is that Gojo, his being caught off guard was something that he feasibly could have been on guard for. You know, it was just the fact that he was being a little bit cocky and egotistical and thought that he had won the fight and let his guard down. Whereas Sukuna couldn't feasibly have had his guard up for Nobara, right? Like he didn't even think that was a possibility on the table. So yes, he did get caught off guard, but I wouldn't call it the same thing. And then finally, Tear Jordan asked me something that I get asked all of the time, which is, how do you pronounce your name? And the way that I came up with it was manganimist. And to wrap us up here, y'all, I got a couple of quick questions, starting with this one from Matt, who asks, why was Sukuna laughing at the start of chapter 268 in reference to this moment right here? And honestly, I never registered this as laughing, but it is the letters H and A, so maybe that was the intended read there, but the way I read this was that Sukuna was like gasping for air after getting, stripped from Megami. So instead of a laugh, more like a like that's how I took it, at least. But I'd be really curious to see how you guys read this, and if you do think he's laughing, why? And I guess if I'm gonna assume that this is a laugh, maybe he just is finding the humor in the fact that Yuji actually beat him. But given his like kind of shocked or scared expression here and what just happened to him, I'm reading it as like that heavy, like exasperated breath. And then finally today, Diamante says that if I haven't, I should really consider checking out JJK Phantom Parade for its story and characters. And this is something I want to do, and I've been meaning to check it out for like months. But the main reason I haven't is because it is a mobile game, and I would want to stream it because I feel like that would be a fun stream to do for the community. We could check it out together. I mean, I don't know if it would be a good stream game or not, but I've just been too lazy to figure out how to set up an emulator so that I could like play it on my PC and thus stream it. So that's the main reason I haven't. Laziness. But I do plan on checking this out at some point. But for those of you that have played it, let me know if you think it's good. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one, y'all. Thank you guys so much for the questions, and thank you for watching.